Take a minute and think about what a scientist does. What did you come up with? Well, if you're like most people, you thought about one thing. They experiment. The experiment is one of the classic ways to test ideas in science. But what exactly is it? An experiment is a process in which scientists try to keep as many factors as possible from changing, and then they change just one or a small number of variables to see how they affect the conditions being tested. For example, I'm an environmental chemist, and one of the things I study is how different environmental conditions affect certain pollutants like mercury and how they move from soil into the atmosphere. A few years ago, I had the opportunity to collaborate with some colleagues in Brazil to look at how deforestation in the Amazon rainforest might affect mercury pollution in the region. So we set up an elaborate experiment. We constructed a special Teflon chamber that could be placed on the soil surface, and we flew in some expensive equipment that could tell us how much mercury was building up in the chamber. Then we used this system to take measurements in the natural world. We first studied the intact rainforest. We then set up our monitoring equipment in exactly the same way and studied how pollutants move from soil to air after most of the larger trees had been cut down in a small area of the forest. In the final step, we burned down the trees on the exact same location, a practice that's used to clear forest land in Brazil. After the fires had died down, we returned to the exact same spot and used the exact same equipment, and again measured the movement of pollutants from the soil to the atmosphere. So while we weren't in a lab and certainly weren't wearing white coats, we did carry out an experiment. We held many of the variables constant, we used the same equipment, we worked over the same plot of soil, we conducted experiments on days that had similar temperature and weather conditions, and then we were able to change just a few variables. We burned down the trees in that area. All experiments are like this in that they compare one situation to another. You can't conduct an experiment by doing one thing. Had I simply visited a forest after it had been burned down, it would have given me information only about one situation, not the previous one. Experiments require controls, meaning an experiment has to be conducted under at least two different conditions that are similar to each other in almost all ways, but they have one or a small number of important differences that are known. In my case, one control was the measurements in the intact forest. The forest controls provided me with a measure of the behavior of mercury before the forest was cut down. In addition, I had other controls, methodological controls, in which I studied the response of my instruments before they were even placed over the soil. I placed them over a clean surface to see if there was any contamination to my equipment or whether there was any interference from another factor that I had not expected. The nature of the research question being asked often defines the design of the experiment and the controls being used. For example, because I specifically asked how the type of deforestation common in Brazil affected pollutant exchange, it was important to not simply cut and remove the trees, but instead burn them down. The equipment I chose had to be capable of measuring the pollutants in question, but also had to be portable and rugged enough to be transported to a small isolated section of the Amazon rainforest. Further, I needed two types of controls. First, methodological controls to see how my instruments would respond in the Amazon, and second, an experimental control, the one in the rainforest, to measure the baseline level of pollutants in the forest. Experiments are used in almost all different aspects of science. Chemists will measure how efficient different catalysts are in converting certain vegetable oils into usable fuel. Biologists might measure how animals respond to different types of drugs used to cure an illness. Even psychologists might measure how people respond to different environmental conditions. For example, how the furniture in an interrogation room might affect the rate at which people give truthful or false testimony to a police officer. What links all of these studies together is that they are carefully planned and carefully controlled. Since it's key to understand which variables change and which don't during an experiment, make sure you understand what the variables and conditions are in your experiment. And if you don't, be sure to ask your mentor for help.